Imagine approaching a city that seems impossible. It rises from the middle of a vast lake. Thousands of canoes move through a maze of canals. Stone causeways stretch toward the mainland. Markets overflow with food, cotton, feathers, cacao, and precious goods. At the center, enormous temples rise above the rooftops. And surrounding the city are fields built directly into the wetlands. This was Tenochtitlan. By the early 16th century, it had become one of the largest cities in the world, with perhaps 200,000 inhabitants. And yet, less than 200 years earlier, the Mexica had been newcomers in the Valley of Mexico, struggling to find a place to settle. They had no horses. No iron. No wheeled vehicles for transporting heavy loads. And still, they transformed a difficult island environment into the political and economic center of a powerful empire. But the same empire that conquered its neighbors would eventually be brought down by a combination of war, disease, and alliances. This is the rise and fall of the Mexica, better known today as the Aztecs. Chapter 1: The people who arrived too late. In the 13th century, the Mexica entered the Valley of Mexico. They were not the first civilization to call the region home. The valley was already filled with powerful city-states, competing kingdoms, farms, temples, and established political networks. The newcomers had little land and few allies. According to Mexica tradition, their patron deity Huitzilopochtli instructed them to search for a specific sign. An eagle perched on a cactus. When they eventually found the sign on an island in Lake Texcoco, they founded their settlement there. The traditional date is 1325. Whether every detail of the story happened exactly as later tradition described is difficult to know. But the location was real. And it was challenging. The island offered little conventional farmland. So instead of trying to escape the environment, the Mexica learned to exploit it. They began transforming water into infrastructure. And that decision would change everything. Chapter 2: Building Tenochtitlan. The first great challenge was food. The Mexica developed and expanded a sophisticated form of wetland agriculture known as the chinampa system. Chinampas were artificial agricultural plots constructed in shallow lake and wetland environments. Farmers built up fertile soil and organic material into raised plots, often planting trees along their edges to stabilize them. Between the plots were canals. The canals were not wasted space. They became transportation routes. Canoes could move people, crops, and supplies through the agricultural landscape without the need for roads. The result was an extraordinarily productive environment surrounding the capital. And the city itself continued to expand. Tenochtitlan was connected to the mainland by major raised causeways. According to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the city eventually had 3 major causeways connecting it to the shores of the lake, while 2 aqueducts supplied fresh water. Fresh water was essential. The lakes around the Valley of Mexico were not simply one giant freshwater reservoir. So the Mexica developed systems to bring fresh water toward the city. One major source was the springs at Chapultepec. Water was carried toward Tenochtitlan through aqueducts, allowing the growing population to depend on a more reliable supply. And then there was the problem of flooding. The Mexica and their neighbors constructed large hydraulic works, including dikes and causeways, to manage water levels and protect important areas. This was not simply a city sitting on water. It was a city constantly managing water. And that distinction matters. Tenochtitlan was an enormous engineering project. Streets and canals formed a transportation network. Markets connected producers and merchants. Causeways linked the island to the mainland. Aqueducts supplied fresh water. And chinampas helped feed the population. By the late 15th and early 16th centuries, Tenochtitlan Tlatelolco may have had 200,000 or more inhabitants. The city had become something its founders could hardly have imagined. But engineering alone could not build an empire. For that, the Mexica needed power. Chapter 3: The Triple Alliance. In 1428, everything changed. Tenochtitlan joined forces with two other powerful city-states, Texcoco and Tlacopan. Together, they formed what historians call the Triple Alliance. The alliance defeated the Tepanec power that had dominated the region. And after that victory, expansion accelerated. The empire did not usually work like a modern nation-state. Instead, conquered cities often retained their own rulers and local institutions. But they were expected to recognize the power of the alliance and provide tribute. And tribute was enormous. Food, cotton, feathers, cacao, clothing, luxury goods, and other valuable resources. Tribute records preserved in documents such as the Codex Mendoza show how carefully these payments were organized. The system allowed wealth from across Mesoamerica to flow toward the imperial capital. And Tenochtitlan used that wealth to build. The Templo Mayor was repeatedly enlarged. Palaces expanded. Markets grew. Ceremonial spaces became more impressive. The city became the center of a political system stretching across much of central Mexico. But there was another force driving expansion. War. Military success brought prestige. It brought tribute. And it brought prisoners. Religion was deeply connected to political power. The Mexica performed rituals that included bloodletting and human sacrifice, practices that were part of their religious worldview. To understand the empire, it is important not to reduce it to sacrifice. The Mexica were farmers, merchants, soldiers, artists, architects, administrators, priests, and scholars. Their civilization was much larger than its most sensational reputation. But their military expansion created enemies. And those enemies would matter enormously. Chapter 4, An Empire Full of Enemies. By the beginning of the 16th century, the Mexica Empire looked powerful. But power is not the same thing as stability. Many subject cities had reasons to resent imperial rule. Tribute could be heavy. Military campaigns could be brutal. And not every major rival had been defeated. One of the most important was Tlaxcala. The Tlaxcalans remained independent and fought repeatedly against the Mexica. So while Tenochtitlan appeared dominant, the political landscape around it was complicated. The empire depended on a network of relationships. That network could hold together as long as the Mexica remained powerful. But what would happen if a new enemy arrived? In 1519, that question was about to be answered. Chapter 5, The Strangers from the Sea. In 1519, Hernán Cortés arrived on the Gulf Coast with a small Spanish expedition. At first glance, the numbers seemed absurd. A few hundred Spaniards were entering a region dominated by powerful indigenous states. The Spanish could not defeat the Mexica alone. But Cortés did not fight alone. He built alliances. Among his most important allies were the Tlaxcalans, longtime enemies of the Mexica. Other indigenous groups also became involved in the conflict. This changed the balance completely. The conquest of the Mexica Empire was not simply a story of a few hundred Spaniards defeating millions of people. It was a much larger indigenous conflict in which Spanish forces became the leaders of a coalition fighting against Tenochtitlan. And then came something even more devastating. Disease. Smallpox had arrived in Mexico with the Spanish and their allies. The population had no previous exposure to the disease and therefore lacked the same level of immunity found in populations where smallpox had circulated for generations. The epidemic devastated communities across central Mexico. Among those who died was Cuitlahuac, who had become ruler after the death of Moctezuma II. The empire was now facing war and epidemic disease at the same time. And Cortés was preparing to return. Chapter 6, The Siege of Tenochtitlan. In 1521, Cortés returned to the Valley of Mexico. But this time, he had a huge indigenous coalition behind him. The target was Tenochtitlan. The city had once been protected by the very environment that had made it difficult to build. The lake. The canals. The causeways. But the Spanish coalition adapted. Cortés constructed brigantines, small ships designed for operations on Lake Texcoco. The lake was no longer simply the Mexica's defensive advantage. It became a battlefield. The siege lasted 93 days. Food became scarce. Water supplies were disrupted. Disease continued to weaken the population. And the fighting became increasingly brutal. Inside the city, Cuauhtémoc led the resistance. The defenders fought desperately. But the situation became impossible to sustain. On August 13, 1521, Tenochtitlan fell. After nearly 3 months of siege, one of the greatest cities in the Americas had been defeated. The political order that had dominated central Mexico was collapsing. But the story was not as simple as Spain defeated the Aztecs. Thousands upon thousands of indigenous allies had fought alongside the Spanish. The fall of Tenochtitlan was the result of military alliances, political divisions, disease, siege warfare, and Spanish intervention coming together at the same moment. The empire had not been destroyed by one weapon. It had been overwhelmed by a chain reaction. Chapter 7: The City Beneath the City. After the conquest, the Spanish began transforming Tenochtitlan. Temples were demolished. Stones were reused. The political center of the new Spanish colony was constructed over the old Mexica capital. Eventually, Mexico City grew over the remains of Tenochtitlan. Today, much of the ancient city lies beneath the modern metropolis. But not everything disappeared. In Xochimilco, remnants of the ancient Chinampa agricultural landscape survive. The canals still exist. And farmers still cultivate raised plots within the wetland environment. The ancient system did not simply vanish. It became part of the landscape that survived beneath the modern city. Chapter 8: What the Aztecs Really Left Behind. The Mexica are often remembered through two images: warriors and sacrifice. But those images tell only part of the story. The people who built Tenochtitlan had to solve enormous problems. How do you feed a massive population on an island? How do you transport food without roads? How do you bring fresh water into a city surrounded by lakes? How do you control flooding? How do you build a political system capable of collecting tribute from hundreds of communities? They developed answers to all of these problems. Tenochtitlan became a major urban center, with canals, causeways, aqueducts, markets, temples, palaces, and agricultural systems supporting a huge population. And perhaps the most fascinating part of the story is this: the Mexica did not conquer nature. They adapted to it. They turned wetlands into farmland. They turned water into transportation. They turned an island into a capital. And they turned a vulnerable settlement into the center of a powerful empire. But the empire itself had a weakness. Its political relationships were never as permanent as the stone buildings of its capital. When enemies found a way to unite against it, disease weakened the population, and the Spanish brought new military technology and tactics into the conflict, the system began to collapse. Tenochtitlan had taken generations to build. Its political order disappeared with astonishing speed. The city that refused to disappear. The Mexica Empire is gone. Tenochtitlan is gone. But the city did not completely disappear. It survives beneath Mexico City. Its ruins remain. Its agricultural traditions survive. Its artifacts survive in museums. And its story survives in the history of the Americas. A people who arrived as outsiders built a city in the middle of a lake. They transformed water into farmland. They connected an island to the mainland. They created one of the largest cities in the world. They built an empire. And then, in 1521, that empire fell. Not because its builders were incapable. But because even the greatest cities can depend on political systems that are far more fragile than the stone beneath them. The rise of Tenochtitlan was a story of human ingenuity. Its fall was a lesson in how quickly power can change. And that is the story of the Aztecs. If you enjoyed this documentary, subscribe to Lumiora for more stories about the civilizations, wars, and ideas that shaped human history.